Welcome, everybody, to the 11th Annual Economic and Political Preview for Latin America. As I say, this is the 11th time we've done this. We would normally be doing this sitting in a big salon in Toronto on bar stools during the event, and likely sitting on bar stools before and after the event as well. But we're doing it virtually this year, and everybody would know why. And the advantage of doing that this year is we can bring in more participants. We don't have to have everybody in Toronto. So we're making best of the situation and hopefully making it better than it has been before. This is the first of our event, of course, for 2021. For those of you who have been with us for a lot of last year's events, you know that we run a very full slate of public events. Some of you may know we also run a full slate of private events for our premium stakeholders as well. For those who would like to find out more about our premium membership, feel free to contact Martha Blackwell at martha.blackwell@ccacanada.com. I guess the final bit to note is that the video of this event will be posted on our website likely tomorrow. This is going to end a little bit later today than we normally do, so we will hope to get it up by tomorrow. I don't think that I have any other housekeeping matters to take care of, and very much want to get straight away into the meat of the event. The other thing I should say is we will not cover every country. We just don't have time to do that, but we certainly will be covering many of the countries, certainly all the Pacific Alliance countries, certainly Brazil, Argentina, and we also need to set aside time, which we have at the beginning, on some of the overarching issues that we think are particularly important now in dealing with Latin America and where Latin America sits in the world, and where Latin America now sits vis-a-vis its northern partners, and specifically this year because of the change of administration with the United States. So we will start off with our main panelists, and our country-specific analysts will join us after we finish the overarching themes, and we'll introduce them as their country arises. So we start off with Jonathan Hausman, who's Managing Director and Head of Global Strategic Relationship at Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. Fiona Mackie, Director, Latin America and the Caribbean at the Economist Intelligence Unit in London. Shannon O'Neill, Vice President and Senior Fellow, Latin America Council of Foreign Relations in New York. I should mention Jonathan is sitting in Toronto. John Price is Managing Director, America's Market Intelligence in Miami, and maybe sitting in Europe at this moment, I believe, right? And Eduardo Suarez, Vice President, Latin American Economics at Scotiabank, and Eduardo is sitting in Mexico City, and I am today sitting myself in New York City. And when we get to the country specialists, they're all sitting in the country of their specialty. So without further ado, let's get right to the meat of it. And clearly, any conversation about where Latin America is going economically and politically, given 2020, has to first start with a conversation about COVID. So I was wondering, Jonathan, if you could start off a little bit talking about the effects of COVID. You know, as we know, at the end of 2020, Latin America stood with the highest COVID infection and mortality as a percentage of total population in the world, and has suffered the greatest economic decline, 8% in real terms, close to 15% in US dollar terms, of any region in the world. And as we've talked about, even I know in this event last year, Latin America was already considered to be falling behind globally in pre-COVID, certainly with respect to Asia. Given what's gone on with COVID, what does this mean for Latin America now? Does this set them back further? And if so, what seems to be the path forward for Latin America in the global setting?
Well, thanks, Ken. And before I get started, I just want to thank all the people who have joined us here today. As chair of the council, it is gratifying to know that we can adapt our programming to these unusual circumstances. I want to recognize Ken Frankel and Marta Blackwell, our esteemed management, who have really made this pandemic work for the Canadian Council for the Americas, and we hope work for all of you. So thank you, Ken. Thank you, Marta. On to your question. So some of the premises of your question I'm going to question, actually. I actually don't think Latin America is so different than anywhere else in terms of the going into the pandemic, which is to say that Latin America is not any worse off really than any region. I mean, the UK, IMF has growth at -10, India -10. So it's not that LATAM has been extraordinarily hit. It's really the question of what happens on the other side. And that is what I'd like to address here. I think it's often a tendency for us to compare Latin America as an emerging market region with Asia. And it said, well, Asia, which has clearly had a different experience, I mean, according to the IMF, last year, China actually achieved positive growth of over 1%, and next year should be somewhere around the 8s. India should be returning to an 8 to 9% growth. So clearly, that is a difference. But instead of opposing China and the rest of the greater China with much of Latin America, we have to think about those as actually in tandem. Because in fact, if you look at some of the big countries in Latin America, and I'm specifically talking here about Brazil, Argentina, Peru, and Chile, these are countries that will rebound quite quickly as a result of the very substantial rebound in Asia, and particularly in Greater China. So I actually would say that whereas it is absolutely true that the region as a whole, and I'll get to the question of how various the region is, but as a whole is not well suited to having a pandemic like this. Clearly, this is a shot in the chops for countries that have weaker fiscal conditions in general, although not always, and weaker productivity, and you could argue weaker institutions. But I do personally, as an investor, view the prospects on the other side as better than most. So I'll give you three reasons. The first one I've already said, which is the big Asia story is going to be very positive for countries that have a strong reliance upon commodities, on the rebound and growth in that region. Number two, we are living in a world of lower forever. So the financial conditions that obtain for the foreseeable future are going to be highly accommodative. I mean, it's easy to see, just looking at the U.S., that the political incentives for policymakers have moved from growing the pie to reducing inequality, and that it essentially means keeping the rates at very low levels for a very long time. That is good for large emerging markets in Latin America that have weak external positions, particularly a country like Brazil. The third thing, which may not be as obvious, is really the question of virology and vaccines. So I'm a great believer, and I'm going to introduce here the question of there are different experiences for different countries in Latin America. So you notice I haven't mentioned Mexico or Colombia. They are much more linked to the U.S., and the U.S. Will have a reasonable rebound, no question, but not the kind of a bouncy return as you'll see in Asia. But the more important question is, who is scale? So big countries do well comparatively, and little countries don't. Even really great little countries like Peru. So Peru is easily the most deeply effective any country I can think of, putting aside Venezuela, of course. And the reason for that is small. And it's highly reliant upon a particular set of consumption in certain countries, particularly the US. And it has had being tied to a relatively small working population with a relatively small number of industries. Big countries, even problematic ones like Brazil, can do better because they can absorb these kinds of shocks and, most importantly, have the capacity to be part of the solution. So Brazil will be a vaccine producer, and no doubt because of its relationship with China, which has been now testing and now rolling out vaccines both from the US and from China, can have a much different experience than small countries. The last thing I want to say is that policy obviously matters, and policy governance matters probably even more. And it's quite various through the region. I think it is fair to say that strong states, not just big countries, but strong states tend to do better. Weak states do worse. So it's rather ironic that the standard bearer of the left in Latin America and Mexico has a fiscal austerity that is having a deep impact on both the present conditions and what we can imagine future conditions to be. Whereas in Brazil, run by a putative conservative and a Milton Friedmanite at the helm of the economy, is doing everything possible to prime the pump and creating, through a strong state, relatively speaking, a pretty strong recovery for a country with a relatively low long-term potential growth rate. So more optimistic than most, but we have to look at things through the prism of variousness because different experiences for different countries.
Thank you. Jonathan. Fiona, did you want to jump in on this question?
Sure. I mean, I totally agree with Jonathan that we really need to distinguish among economies. And I think what we're seeing when we look at 2021 is we have to look at a few different issues. So we need to look at vaccine rollout. And I think there's a clear distinction between those countries by virtue of their size or their production capacity or their participation in testing that have good access to vaccines, and those countries that are reliant, for example, on the WHO's COVAX facility. And there are a lot of them in Latin America. So we have that on the one hand, plus the capacity of health systems to actually roll out the vaccine. And there are big questions about that we can get into. But just moving on, I think there's also a question around the scope for fiscal and monetary, but particularly fiscal stimulus measures and how long countries can hold out on those. And that will have a significant bearing on how economies will perform as we look ahead to the recovery in 2021. And then, of course, back in 2020, and again, looking ahead, economic structure will really matter. So, for example, those countries on aggregate in Latin America, we know that there's a lot of informal sector employment, and that meant that Latin America, in some respects, was hit particularly hard. But there's a big differential between what we're seeing in Uruguay or Chile and what we saw in Bolivia. And I think that will be significant again as we look out to the recovery in 2021. But I think ultimately, most importantly, and Jonathan touched on this as well, is what matters is institutions and the business environment and policy effectiveness. And as we look further out, those questions of fiscal stimulus and the vaccine rollout, those will matter in Q1, Q2, but as we look ahead to later in 2021, and we think about the medium term and beyond, we need to think of those issues and which countries are better placed from a policy perspective. And I think what we also need to be thinking about now, and I think companies should be thinking about, and policymakers should be thinking about, are the big policy shifts that are to come in Latin America. So we're going to have some long-term scarring from a lack of investment from this COVID crisis. There's going to be some longer-term potential, for example, from shifts in economic structure and the developments of tech, e-commerce, for example, and how those shifts are going to impact economies in Latin America, and whether or not policymakers can really take advantages of those shifts. And then the last thing that I think is really the most important thing is to see what governments are doing in terms of really difficult policy questions like labor market reform, and are they going to make labor markets more flexible or less flexible? In an ideal world, they'd be more flexible, but we'd also have reforms to really improve social safety nets. And then in other areas like tax, infrastructure, industrial policy. So I think that's really what we need to be looking out for. And we might, on balance, I'm not super optimistic given problems of policy effectiveness in the region, and also bearing in mind that it's a relatively busy and important election year in Latin America. But hopefully there is the opportunity to see some progress in these areas that would put Latin America in a better position to recover.
Thank you very much. John, I'm going to turn it to you for 1 second, but just a note to the audience. At this point, we're doing some overarching issues. And after we get to them, we're going to get into country-specific analysis. So I know, for example, there's a question about Peru and one about Chile. We will deal with those questions when we get precisely to the segments when we're dealing with Peru and Chile. So please be patient, but we will get to those. Having said that, John, you wanted to jump in quickly on this question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to a couple of points that Fiona made and perhaps darken the outlook that Jonathan pointed out. And that is that the biggest long-term damage that we're seeing from COVID is the impact that lockdowns had on distribution of income. We did some surveys in June. So this was towards the end of the first wave of lockdowns. And we interviewed 2,000 households between Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, all with very different levels of lockdowns. And what we found was that there was a strong correlation between those people subject to lockdowns and an absolute destruction of income capacity. And we're talking about the 50 to 60% of the population that are informally employed, who probably have no more than $200 of savings that they can count upon when incomes dry up or slow down. And that worsening of distribution of income, we're talking about poverty levels that have returned to where they were 15 to 20 years ago. The problem with that is, although those incomes will recover quickly as these economies recover, history suggests that when we have a worsening of distribution of income, politics turns towards something much more populist and begins to lose faith in the institutions that brought the economy to where it is today. And a lot of the outrage that we saw in 2019 expressed in countries like Colombia and Chile, Honduras, Bolivia, and elsewhere, which are part politics of the time and part real angst of this underclass, we are going to see come back. And they're going to come back both on the street and in the ballot box. And therein lies the risk, I think, of the COVID hangover, is a political hangover where we move towards even more populist policies.
Thank you very much, John. That's a great segue into the next question, which I want to direct to Eduardo and bring him into the conversation. Is going into COVID, we all knew what the inefficiencies, what the inequalities were in Latin America, the severe lack in social services, in education, in healthcare, internet access, financial inclusion, which we saw the consequences of that in COVID. Coming out of COVID, and given those situations, what is the state of public treasuries to try and address not just what it needed to address before COVID, but what may even be exacerbated because of COVID? Is there money there, and are there ways for them to address these issues, in part because they need to be addressed, and in part because, as the point John raised about the political unrest, the civil unrest? Eduardo.
Thank you. I think there's two angles to this question. The first one is the starting point and the shock that public finances took in the countries in the region, which is very different. Countries like Peru or Chile, even after the shock, will still have relatively low debt burdens, around 30-40% of GDP. So they have more space. Countries like Brazil, where you had a huge jump in debt and a high starting point, and you now see gross general government debt close to 100% of GDP, have their hands more tight. But there's also a more nuanced side of this, which is countries don't pay debt with GDP, they pay them with their revenues. And that tends to some degree equalize the countries in the region a little bit. For example, even though the gap between Mexico and Brazil would seem huge when you look at those metrics versus GDP, when you compare Mexico and Brazil with the actual revenues that are supposed to pay that debt, the gap narrows a lot. So the constraints countries have and the deterioration during the crisis is very nuanced. But there's, I think, the most important factor here, and I think a lot of what even certain market players miss in the importance of the dynamics here is, for example, when you look at credit ratings, what matters is not short-term credit ratings, it's long-term credit ratings, because you have to look at long-term fiscal sustainability. And long-term fiscal sustainability always comes back to two things, which is your debt compared to its growth rate, its interest rate, and your revenues compared by its growth rate, which is country growth. So long-term growth dynamics are key, and I think they're the most important part of this question. And the other panelists have to some degree already touched upon this. Capitalism has kicked the butt of any single economic model that has ever been put against it. But it's very important to understand that not all capitalism is built the same. And there's a certain sustainable dynamic here, both on the political and economic performance side. The US has shown us over the last few years why the political sustainability is important for the model to work. And on the other side, and Latin America even more so, on the other side, the success of, on the political and economic front of places like Canada, Japan, and parts of Europe show us that the political sustainability of the model works. What do I mean by this? Capitalism is a race. You have to align all the people in a country, which are what form its economies, to work together and run in the same direction. And that means they have to feel that the race is fair. That means the politics work. On the other side, there's a sustainability side of this fairness, that if you don't have a similar starting point and a similar track for people to run on, it doesn't work. That's what Latin America has failed. Latin America ranks at the very bottom of education achievement of the PISA scores, for example. The property rights don't have the same degree of development, and the contracts don't have the same development as more successful countries. And that is a huge lesson lost to Latin America from for example, Asia's success. And so the capacity of countries to recover from this fiscal shock will come back to that growth capacity. Colombia, for example, entered the COVID shock growing at 4% and expected to grow 4%. Mexico, with its model being questioned and not being bought into by the private sector, it has slowed materially, and we had it in a recession actually before the COVID shock hit. And then there's a final element, I'll just quickly touch upon this, that will determine that growth and hence the fiscal recovery from the shock, which is the capacity and the willingness to jump into the future. The future has very clearly given us two sectors in the global economy, which will be the next big drivers of growth. Renewable energy, which across the region we're having very clear signs of which countries are buying into it and which are not. And the second one is the information economy. And the information economy, you can either be outside of it, you can be a passenger in the bus, or you can try to drive it. Things like, for example, internet access, mobile phone penetration will give us the capacity to jump into the bus. So you will be players in that economy. But if you want to drive it, you have to have, again, it comes back to education. You have to have the venture capital and the capital feeding into innovation. You have to have the people who have the capacity to compete in this economy through education. You have to have property rights, contracts. Latin America, again, fails miserably in this. I would say Latin America is at best jumping into the bus of the knowledge economy as a passenger. Those things have to change. And that will determine the capacity of Latin America to recover from this fiscal shock they had during COVID.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. There's a lot more to be said about the effects of COVID going forward, but I think we need to leave that topic and move on to the next broad overarching topic, which is the involvement, engagement of China in the hemisphere. Is probably not a week goes by where there's not an announcement of another seminar on the implications of China, or at least an enumeration of China's increased investment in various countries throughout Latin America. But what's interesting through the COVID has been what some might call a stronger soft power intent of the Chinese through COVID diplomacy in supplying supplies and vaccines now and the like. And this is always something that's been considered to be an Achilles heel for China, its soft power abilities compared to some of its competitor countries. And so I'd like to bring Shannon into the conversation. And Shannon, thanks for your patience. What do you make about China's quote COVID diplomacy, and is it having what is the reception in Latin America? How do they feel about that, and is it having its intended effect to soften up the feelings about China in the various countries?
Sure. Well, there's so much to say about the last conversation, but let's move to this one. I think the last 8 months have been sort of a mixed bag for China on the soft diplomacy. So there was this big push. They were going to provide masks and protective equipment and other things. And, some countries, they were providing it, but countries were paying for it. This was a magnanimous gift to these countries. They were buying it. The equipment has turned out to be somewhat sketchy in some places. So some of the masks were faulty, some of the deliveries never came. So I think that was pretty much a mixed bag in what China can do and will do for the region. So I think that's one part. Now, China has another opportunity now with the vaccine to push forward. And if they roll it out and they're a bit more magnanimous and it's an effective vaccine and it's only one dose, if those sorts of things work, then you could see actually this soft power work in Latin America or gain more traction than the last round. But we have already seen some of the countries pushing back on this, right? Brazil has said it's going to go with the European or the US one. Mexico has contracted with China, but it has not yet been approved by their sanitary authority, right? So their FDA has not yet approved it because there's no reciprocal agreement. The US one has been approved because there's a reciprocal agreement with the US FDA. The European one, the same thing, they have this reciprocal agreement. We don't have that with China. So there's a question here about whether they will be able to deliver the vaccine when they weren't able to deliver the masks, frankly. So I'm a little bit more cautious about the power of the soft power. The other thing I want to put on the table is, China, especially under Xi, we've seen a rise in the foreign ministry and within the state-owned development, state-owned companies and the like, of this role of what they're calling, wolf warrior diplomacy. So China is not being as nice and quiet and a sort of developing country as it has in the past. And so this is much more apparent when you look at Southeast Asia or you look at some of China's neighbors, where they're playing much harder ball in terms of various, policies that countries are putting in and the like. But I could see this filtering down as we get to Latin America as well. So you have a foreign ministry and other diplomats in China that are taking a much more aggressive stance, frankly, and a little bit more my way or the highway, which I also think it challenges this idea that soft diplomacy will really make strides in Latin America.
So at best, the jury is still out.
At best, the jury's still out.
Okay, great. We're going to come back to the China issue in a few minutes. As you know, Shannon, we talk about the U.S. and the prospects for the Biden government and Biden administration to make inroads in Latin America. Fiona, maybe I would just call on you, just if you wanted to say a few words about the economic impact of what China has been doing in Latin America over the last year and where you see maybe them moving just economically in the penetration and other economic actors that have now entered into Latin America.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very different picture. And to an extent, the soft power doesn't matter so much because economically it's doing so much. And those ties between China and Latin America have really solidified over the course of recent years. And again, sort of from an economic basis in 2020. So it was really sort of China's early recovery from the COVID crisis economically, its demand for soft and hard commodities that really sort of kickstarted Latin America's recovery once it started to reopen around mid-year. And we've seen that although, the recovery in exports in Latin America differs around the region, in almost every case, those countries that are more reliant on China as a trade partner are doing better because of that Chinese demand. And that won't change, in terms of the importance of trade partners. You can see that, if you exclude Mexico from the numbers, China's already the most important trade partner. Take a country like Chile, it's 40% of its exports go to China. It's about to send a whole bunch of cherries to China for Chinese New Year. That makes sense, and it's not going to change. I think, sort of in terms of other elements of the relationship economically, we've seen a shift. So, for example, China gave lots and lots of money to Venezuela, and it had its fingers burnt. So there'll be countries like Argentina, like Ecuador, depending on the results of the upcoming election, that will be looking to China to try to secure finance amid sort of increasingly binding financing constraints. And I don't think China is going to necessarily be receptive in terms of just providing lots and lots of funds, but it will use that as sort of an entry point into like expanding the BRI both and investments both in size and in scope. And initially when China sort of moved into LATAM, it was all about natural resources and infrastructure, only insofar as only that infrastructure that it used to get those natural resources out of the country and back to China. But that's shifted a lot in recent years. And also we've seen not just a shift in the sort of the kinds of projects that China's working on in LATAM, but also a shift from not just state enterprises to the private sector and new enterprises like Huawei, not that new, but like also Alibaba in the retail sector is going to be moving into Latin America in a big way, I think. And to the extent that that's problematic for the U.S. administration, it's a policy challenge because it doesn't necessarily reflect policy. It reflects the fact that U.S. firms, Canadian firms, European firms, they are doing their due diligence when it comes to things like the potential for political risk, corruption, contract rights, rule of law, and that is why whereas in China we've seen sort of there hasn't been a lot of emphasis on conditionality, whether it's in lending or in investment. So it's really difficult for the US or Canadian or European private enterprises to keep pace when they are understandably and reasonably concerned with sort of those elements of policy in the region. So sort of looking ahead to, well, what is the solution to that? The solution to that on the part of US and Canadian policymakers would be to continue to work, or in the case of the US, to go back to working on institution building, tax transparency, all of those efforts that ultimately are going to bring in private investment. On top of that, I think there is a question around whether or not the FTC in the US, development banks can actually work more creatively to make projects that might be borderline actually profitable and get more private sector operators working in Latin America that wouldn't otherwise.
Thank you, Fiona. We'll come back to some of these questions again and when we go into the country-specific segments. So I'm going to leave it again. I know many other people want to say something about it, but I want to move on to our last overarching issue, and that is, and it's certainly the one that has been highlighted over the last number of days, is the issue about the incoming Biden administration and what kind of influence it can have in Latin America to move it away from a situation where in a number of the large countries is a bit troublesome. And I know, Shannon, this is something that you've written about. I was just on Bloomberg television yesterday, as you know, talking about it. But, you know, the incoming Biden administration talks about its priorities being human rights, restoring democracy and shoring up democracy where it's weak, anti-corruption matters, obviously climate change is on that, and we haven't even gotten to helping the economies rebuild post-COVID, and yet it's unclear how much sway or influence the Biden government will have in the hemisphere. You know, the three biggest countries demonstrated through the last 4 years, and certainly through the campaign, in various shades of aggression and less than much subtlety, that it openly supported Donald Trump. And there I'm speaking, of course, of Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. And we know in other countries, particularly in Central America, but elsewhere, the Trump penchant for loving dictators and hands off and on authoritarian procedures. In those countries, they've had a free ride, basically. How does President Biden address this? And what's a realistic hope that some of these progressive, I'll use the word, I'll just say democratic measures can be brought back and set on the right course again? Shannon.
So fair enough, right? The world has changed since Obama and Biden were last in charge of, U.S. Latin America policy and in there. And yeah, we have seen the leadership of, at least Mexico and Brazil be leaning hard in the direction of Donald Trump. The Colombians backed away fairly quickly after the election results came forward. But I would say that when you look at Latin America and you look at polling in Latin America, yes, there are some leaders that would favor Trump administration, but the vast majority of Latin Americans do not, right? And the vast majority of Latin Americans actually prefer this more progressive agenda. So you have a bigger population that cares about democracy and human rights and like, now there's challenges there to be sure, right? There's warts and all, and the support for democracy in Latin America has fallen in the last 4 years as well. So there are real challenges there, but I think there is a larger population that is amenable and open to a different kind of U.S. administration, and frankly searches for leadership, a different kind of leadership from the United States. So there, I think there's some support. The other thing I think we're going to see a real difference in a Biden administration from a Trump administration is that it actually will be, as wonky people like to talk about in Washington, it's going to be a whole of government approach. So rather than a policy towards Latin America or countries in Latin America that come just out of the White House, out of a small group of people, you're going to have all these different agencies with the different types of agendas that they have, whether it's Department of State or Homeland Security or agriculture or commerce or all these myriad agencies and departments. You are going to have experts coming back into the field and trying to do their job and having responsibility to do their job. And I think that actually taking it away from one person and one relationship and personality to dozens of people who are trying to do their job, I think that too actually can lower the temperature, but also mean this more kind of plodding bureaucratic approach. It actually means stuff gets done, because I think the challenge over the last 4 years is a couple of people would sit in a room, big ideas would be thrown around, but you wouldn't actually get the mechanisms of government on either side doing very much. So there really wasn't much of a policy. So I think that also will make a difference. And then the other thing I would just say is that, one thing that I think is a huge opportunity for a Biden administration is what we started this off talking about, is that this is a region, like many around the world, but a region that has been devastated by COVID. We see huge increases in inequality. We see huge increases in instability. We see political changes happening there. And I think there's a space for a U.S. government to come in. And I think there's a potential desire to and help with the distribution of vaccines, right? And this is the difference between, I think, China will sell a vaccine to Latin America, but how do you distribute the vaccine, right? How do you get it? Whether it's the US government or whether it's the Gates Foundation or other kinds of nonprofits, how do you make sure that the vaccine gets beyond just the 20% of the middle or upper classes in Latin America who reside in the big cities and actually gets to these people who have the tens of millions that are falling into poverty? And there, I think the US government, USAID, along with the US civil society and stuff, there's a real role that they could play that would renew some of this faith and then allow this broader agenda to go forward after.
Yeah, I think it's going to be, and we'll call on some other panelists I know want to get in on it. I think it's going to be a bit of a challenge, because it's one thing to think that some of these governments, like in Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, just didn't think through what their strategy was. But they knew very much the risk that Biden could win, and they didn't care. Basically, they still put their money down. In the past, you wouldn't have seen something like that. I'm not that I can recall. And even in the congratulatory tweet from President Duque to Biden, he said, "I look forward to collaborating on," and then he laid out the agenda that was, quote, the right-wing agenda in Colombia: security and drug dealers. There was no mention of the issues that he wanted to collaborate on that are important to Biden: human rights, democracy, right, which is under huge fire in Colombia. It's going to be a challenge, because these people they may have backed down. Anyway, Jonathan, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, very, very quickly, just two things. Just first addressing your last point. I think we have to distinguish between countries and leaders. AMLO is AMLO, and Bolsonaro is Bolsonaro, and they have views that I think most Brazilians would agree don't necessarily reflect the greater populace of Brazil. And I'm not talking about the more egregious ones only. The second point is, I think it's about looking at the broader diagnostic globally in terms of the competition between the United States and China. It's not really just that the Biden administration is focused on human rights and democratic development. It's focused on being relevant. And so even if China is only half good at the soft power that it has at least a chance of deploying in the region, it is a major problem for the United States. And I'm not intoning some kind of Monroe doctrine. I'm talking about whose technology platform our country's going to use, who's going to own the data flow, who's going to own the building blocks of the new economy? The United States has a serious interest in particularly in large countries in Latin America, in reasserting its position. And it certainly doesn't come from a popularity contest because one leader likes another leader. It comes from what are the basic interests of American commerce and American influence. So I would be very surprised if the administration didn't make a concerted effort to become more relevant and to, just as Shannon was saying, to do some very easy things to be on the agenda yet again. I think there's been this lull, and it wasn't just, of course, in the last 4 years, it's really been in the last 12, where very little has been done to express American interests. So I think there'll probably be a ready audience too, because who says that that those specific leaders, particularly in Brazil and in Mexico, speak for the entire elite.
Thank you, Jonathan. I know everybody wants in, so if everybody has a few second response, Fiona, will come to you first, and then I think John wanted to say something, and then we're going to start to move to our country-specific analysis with Mexico. Fiona, before we do that, do you want to say something?
Just really briefly, I would throw in there a return to multilateralism, and I think it would be beneficial for Latin American economies if the US under Biden would actually revisit, for example, the expansion of IMF SDR allocations, or some other way to actually look at debt relief in a multilateral way, in a cooperative way, in the G20, for example, or via the IMF. And in particular, to look at that as it relates to Latin America, and to try to be able to address the fact that a lot of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are not sort of eligible for a lot of concessional support because they're classified as upper middle income countries, when we know there's still a lot of poverty, income inequality, problems with high levels of indebtedness. So I would just throw that out there, that I think this is the opportunity for the US, for example, to take the lead on bigger global initiatives that really address sort of the problems of emerging markets in Latin America in particular.
Thank you, Fiona. John, you have 30 seconds. You want to talk about social networks in Latin America, in the region.
Very briefly, the fact that Donald Trump was shut off Twitter and Facebook, I think, brought a sense of relief to the whole world who's been listening to this guy every day. But it also sparked a huge debate. Interesting, in Germany and France, immediately the next day their leaders came out and said, this is wrong. It is wrong that technology companies can dictate free speech. That's a government issue, not a technology company or private sector issue. And what's really interesting is an article today by James Bosworth, who said the quote for next year or this year is going to be, well, Trump got kicked off of Twitter for much less. There's at least half a dozen leaders in Latin America that have done far more egregious things to undermine the institutions of democracy in their countries over the last 2 years that would warrant equal treatment by Twitter and Facebook. And you can imagine the foreign, the notion that the Americans are cutting off the voice of their government leaders. So this is going to be a huge bilateral issue between US, the technology companies in the US, and Latin America. And I think it's going to be a much louder issue than any of us realize at this point in time in terms of dictating relationships between the US and the region.
Thank you very much, John. Unfortunately, we have to leave the overarching segment of the webinar behind us and move on so we can drill down into some of these countries more specifically. And we're going to start off with Mexico. And Valeria, I think you have joined us, have you not?
Yes, here I am.
Okay, great. Well, let me introduce Valeria Moy, who's Director General of the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness, joining us from Mexico City. No, Valeria?
Yes.
Okay, and welcome, and thank you for joining us. So, Mexico, what's the path back to recovery for economic recovery? Tatiana Cloutier was just made Minister of Economy, which is sort of an interesting nomination. Where's Mexico going economically, and anything you want to say where you think it's going politically, particularly with midterm elections coming up this year?
Thank you, Ken. Well, as surprising as it may seem, Mexico has not had and currently does not have a specific strategy or fiscal support to foster the economic recovery. The fiscal support that has been given in a couple of programs accounts for around 0.7 of GDP, 0.7% of GDP. We estimate that the fall in GDP during 2020 will be around 9%, which is one of the highest ones that we're going to see in the region. The Minister of Finance, Mr. Arturo Herrera, has said repeatedly in the last couple of days that the path to recovery is set upon the vaccination scheme, which, by the way, sounds extremely worrying. He has added that the strategy for the economic recovery will be designed, that for me, it blows my mind. The strategy for the economic recovery will be designed as soon as an important percentage of the population, say around 70%, is already vaccinated. Bear in mind that although Mexico is indeed receiving vaccines, the Pfizer vaccines so far, they are arriving very slowly. As of yesterday, around 85,000 doses had already been applied, and that represents around 0.06% of the population. Apparently, that might change a bit in the following days, but we don't have clear information. However, the status of the pandemic is very worrying as of now. Mexico City, that accounts for around 60% of GDP, is living the toughest moment of the pandemic. Hospitals, both private and public, are at full capacity. And the governor of Mexico City has declared the capital in red alert level. That supposedly means, or used to mean, that it was going to be a very tough lockdown, that economic activity had to be stopped in all but essential activities. However, that has not happened. Many businesses are open, and the informal sector, which accounts for more than 56% of the occupied population, is working almost as normal. So the way the epidemic is behaving in Mexico City and in Mexico in general, together with the very slow vaccination process that lies ahead, makes the recovery seem very, very slow. Perspectives are not very encouraging. International institutions expect GDP to grow at around 3.5 or 3.7%. That I'm talking about the World Bank or IMF or OECD. The most optimistic estimate is held by the Mexican Minister of Finance that expects an increase of GDP this year of 4.6%. Regardless of the specific number that we see this year, we will see an increase in poverty of around 10 million people, a decrease in the average real wages, and a complicated scenario for a speedy recovery, a very complicated scenario for this year. Investment will be one of the major challenges. It has been decreasing. Investment has been decreasing. Both private and public investment have been decreasing since the beginning of the administration of Mr. López Obrador, who does not have a friendly attitude towards private investment. And of course, the pandemic only made that worse. So that single variable, investment, might be one of the most relevant variables to track today. Mrs. Cloutier, you were asking about Mrs. Cloutier, Ken. The appointment of Mrs. Cloutier to the Ministry of Economy is a political one. She has no experience whatsoever in economy. She studied literature, English literature, so non-experience of trade or economy whatsoever. But we might want to give her the benefit of the doubt. She will have to deal with a lot of relevant issues regarding the USMCA, for example, labor disputes, the energy agenda, because the energy agenda of Mr. López Obrador is completely in an opposite direction of the energy agenda that Biden has. So there might be some clashes there. And now, of course, we will face, including some violations by Mexico of a couple of chapters of the USMCA that deal specifically with the regulators, with regulations, and which the president is intending to change. That speaking about the autonomous regulators in Mexico that the president does not like, and he's trying to disappear them, to make some other ministers of the economy to absorb the functions that those regulators have. So we're expecting to see a very complicated 2021, and then the path to recovery is still very uncertain.
Thank you, Valeria. Well, that was a bit sobering.
I'm sorry.
I thought you.
I would like to be more optimistic, but what can I tell you? Maybe Eduardo has a more optimistic view.
Well, I'm going to turn to Eduardo right now. I thought you were going to say, but on the bright side, AMLO has decided to grant asylum to Donald Trump. But
that's very bright.
That didn't happen. Eduardo, please. Thank you, Valeria. That was perfect. Eduardo, please jump in.
Yeah, not that much better than Valeria's. I would say that AMLO got a fantastically strong mandate because he did understand what the country's problems were. Corruption, inequality, rule of law, security. You can ask anybody in Mexico and they will agree with AMLO's campaign diagnostic of what Mexico's problems are. And his plan with dealing with it has one problem. It's a very good plan if we were sitting in 1970. Using carbon and fossil fuels as an engine of growth is fantastic 40 years ago, but it's not very in line with today's reality. A state-led growth model or hope of a growth model is not very compatible with a country with 90% of employment and 80% of GDP is accounted for by the private sector. I think we're right now in a tipping point. And I think one of the key variables this year will be summer's midterm elections and the fiscal reform that comes out of that. Why? Mexico already has very high corporate income taxes. Corporate income taxes in Mexico account for about 3.5% of GDP, which is already about 60 basis points higher than the average in the OECD. On top of that, we have seen companies in Mexico being slapped with increases in minimum wages that have been extraordinarily high over the next 3 years. We have the outsourcing bill, which if it passes, could add another cost to companies, adding to this already relevant ones. On top of that, we have a pension reform, which will double over the next 10 years the cost of Social Security for the private sector in Mexico. So you keep on adding things that make Mexico more costly to invest in, but at the same time, you're not doing anything to increase productivity. So for this transformation to be able to be sustainable and to generate the resources it needs to be viable, it needs to get the private sector to buy in. And one of the key elements there will be that this year's tax reform, if it comes, and it needs to come because otherwise Mexico is going to lose investment grade, has to be perceived as fair and balanced by the private sector, or we will not have investment and we will not have employment generation going forward. And this transformation will end up cannibalizing itself. So I think we're literally in a year that will make or break AMLO's country project.
Now I'm simply like the optimistic one.
Well, I'm going to come to Jonathan.
They can actually make the choice to fix it, but they have to make it.
Well, then let me ask a question to both of you, and then and the mic is open for Jonathan and Shannon as well. The midterms are coming up. The major opposition parties have all decided to band together to prevent a united front against AMLO's candidate. What are the prospects for that being successful for them, and what would be the consequences following that if it were successful or unsuccessful? Maybe Valeria, do you want to answer that, and then maybe Shannon, then I'll bring in Jonathan as well. Valeria, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Yes, just a little bit. I think that Morena will win, will keep the majority as it already has in these intermediate elections. They have a lot of tools in their hands. For example, the vaccination program is going to be deployed using the same people, the same persons that currently give the social transfers to the population in poverty that receives the transfers. So you might see a person from the government that will be giving a check or giving money in cash and then applying the vaccine to the same people. So tell me in what way that's not an electoral use of the vaccine. We will see a very electoral use of the vaccine. And in these following months, I think that we will see all electoral efforts by the president and by his party to increase his political support throughout the country. I think Morena will take most of the gubernators that are going to be disputed. There are 15. I guess that Morena might take 12 of them. and I think they will keep the majority in the Senate and in the lower house. So I think Morena will, the opposition does not have a relevant agenda or a contrasting agenda. You can't see the opposition right now. So I think Morena will keep control as it has now.
Thank you, Valeria. Thank you very much, Valeria. Shannon, listening to all this, what are your thoughts about it? And if in fact Morena is successful in the midterms, and that what repercussions could that have for the last 3 years of the AMLO administration?
Sure. Well, I think, there's a lot of repercussions. One, I think, is in the political space and having sort of the openness and transparency, having the right to form opposition, having a more level playing field as we head into 2024 presidential elections and other elections. So I think there's a kind of erosion of democracy and some of the hard fought, elements of checks and balances that already we're starting to see be eroded. But I actually think there's a longer term, and not to pile on with what Eduardo and Valeria were saying earlier, but I think there's sort of medium and then longer term economic consequences that are quite disappointing. So, in the short term, and as Valeria pointed out, for 2 years, we have not seen investment in Mexico, and definitely not domestic investment, domestic companies that know Mexico best. There has been some FDI for various reasons, but you have not seen domestic investment. And that, manifests itself 5, 10, 20 years out when you don't have a bigger, more productive economy. And same on the public side, you're not having investment in the kinds of public infrastructure that bring in companies, right? Building refineries or building, trains is not the same as building roads and ports and sort of 21st century infrastructure for manufacturing. So I think that is something that is going to hamper Mexico's long-term structural growth outlook. The other thing that's happening is the changes in the energy sector. And we already saw it just in the last couple of weeks, blackouts happening. And I think especially as we see more return to Pemex and CFE, the electricity company, I think we're going to see more blackouts. So if you're a manufacturing company, you're not going to have electricity is going to be scarce or it's going to be really expensive. So I think right now is a moment, we've seen it for the last 2 years. I think we're going to see it for the next 2 to 5 years where global supply chains are reconfiguring themselves. Part of it is the US-China tensions that are happening, but part of it is the rise of industrial policy, which I think we're seeing across all kinds of nations, and putting in things like green energy or green elements to production and the like. So as these things shake out, companies are going to be relocating. And if they don't relocate to Mexico in the next 2 to 5 years, they probably won't relocate after the sunk costs for a couple decades to come. And then, the last thing I just want to put on the table, which I hate to be sort of more depressing here, but we just saw in the last month or so, a couple European countries talk about they're going to go full electric cars. And we just saw Massachusetts announce, following California, that after 2035, they will ban selling gasoline cars. So you will only have electric cars. And as you look at Mexico's most productive manufacturing base, it is in a gasoline-based auto industry. And so, that is less than 15 years to totally revamp your manufacturing base and become crucial to a different industry. And I don't see this government, the AMLO administration, being really forward looking on that and trying to entice actually the new manufacturing that is going to matter down the road for the next sexenio to come in. So that worries me, is that you have a very backward looking, as Eduardo said, they're looking back at the 1970s, but what is right now their most productive manufacturing base is going to disappear within the next 2 decades.
Okay. John Press, I wouldn't normally turn to you for a bit of good news as the self-confessed contrarian that you are. But on top of that, we've seen an acceleration now of dismantling of the regulatory state in Mexico, the Competition Bureau and the like. Is there anything that, is there any silver lining in any of this? Or is this a slope that seems to be inexorable? What's your thought about that?
There's 2 short-term silver linings, and they're short-term, and they're both a threat. And Shannon just gave a great, explanation of the long-term of the manufacturing, of the threat to manufacturing in Mexico. But in the short term, no change in U.S. government is going to change the fact that U.S. manufacturers are weaning themselves off of China. And it's driven mostly by rising labor costs in China that has been in place now for a slow moving trend for 15 years. And so more and more are moving onshore to Mexico. So in the short term, there's going to be a continued boost. And ironically, Donald Trump, his policies, when taken together, anti-immigrant, anti-China, lower taxes, created much more demand for Mexican manufacturing than ever before. And in fact, the U.S.-Mexico trade deficit ballooned under Trump. And so we will continue to see growth in export-oriented manufacturing, most of it clustered along the border. And the other is, and I'll defer to Eduardo as to how long-lasting this is, the fact that, and going to an area that was sort of overlooked before, is Mexico is the only remaining major economy in Latin America with net positive interest rates. All the other leading economies have interest rates that are lower than inflation. And Mexico is the one remaining country with higher. And that's because they have a hawk in charge of the central bank. Now, AMLO has now nominated 3 governors, and it remains to be seen whether that hawkish stance of Mexico's central bank remains there. But that's the primary reason why Mexico's currency has rebounded better than Brazil's, better than Colombia's. And it's part of the reason why multinationals are relatively bullish on Mexico in the short term, because they know they're going to be able to extract profits back into dollars out of Mexico more easily this year and next than they would in their investments in Brazil, which looks like it's going to be steering towards a cheap real sort of policy framework for at least the next 24 months. So those are 2 positives that unfortunately are only going to reinforce AMLO's belief that he's doing a good job, and therefore not going to lead to any policy changes. And so in the longer term, it's going to hurt even more. But in the short term, I see Mexico performing reasonably well.
Thank you, John. And you mentioned Brazil, so it's a perfect segue. Thank you, Valeria, for your assistance on Mexico and getting us off. And when we do it next year, and we're sure that the news will be more positive from Mexico. I don't know why I say that, but we can always hope that it's better. Again, thank you, Valeria. And we now can switch over, as I mentioned, the segue to Brazil and introduce Thiago de Aragão, who's a senior associate at CSIS. He's based in Brazil. Thiago, you're there, are you not?
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us. Well, you know, the way we've been handling this is, I guess the first question is, what is Brazil's path to recovery from COVID? And what are some of the political implications for Brazil going forward this year that are rising from the way COVID has been handled there?
Well, we have several serious problems in Brazil. COVID management has been terrible, as many of you are aware, because we have gone through many, many months of denial of the depth and the lethality of the problem. And when you have a president who is considered to be extremely influential to a large portion of the population, and even though he is rejected by many, there are still many Brazilians who position themselves as with a regular view of the government, which can be interpreted almost as an approval of the government if your view is regular. It ends up resonating his words against COVID into a situation of collective deniability, especially because taking care of oneself regarding COVID involves sacrifices that many are not willing to take. And the idea of death, it's something that only harms those that are that experience death in their proximities. Those that do not experience death near their proximities, they have a very normalized view of the circumstances, and this is in a way how the president has behaved. So the lack of strategy towards COVID has impacted in several areas, particularly generating a domino effect of lack of strategy. It's a government that lives by the hour. It's not a government that lives by the day or the week or the month. We have a Ministry of Economy that, although as tradition in Brazil, they are much more technical, they are much more balanced, and they're much more pragmatic than any other area of the government, they still need the support from the government, from the presidential palace, in order to execute what they think. And at the same time, we have a minister of economy who has a very optimistic view of the world, sometimes a bit exaggerated optimistic view of the world that comes from his personal trajectory of self-confidence, plus a profound lack of knowledge of the political environment in the country. And this lack of knowledge towards the political environment, which is something intrinsic in the mentality of the president and from other key decision makers in the government, makes that the perception from society towards the government is that the Congress is the root of all evils, when in fact the Congress is a stabilizer in the country. One thing that I always discuss with my clients is that Brazil is not a country that goes through institutional instability or institutional crisis. It's a country that goes through political crisis. It's a very different view, and they're very distinct things. The institutional environment is like a solid house with a very solid electric system, hydroelectric, hydraulic system, etc. But the people living in the house, they're not prepared. They fight, they battle each other constantly. And basically, this is how things are in Brazilian politics. We have solid institutions. So we have Congress that cannot be bypassed by the president, cannot be ignored by the president, and cannot be overruled by the president. We have a judiciary system that is independent and cannot be manipulated by the president. Having said that, the individuals within the Congress, within the judiciary system, and within the executive, they're not ideal because they are following through their personal agendas ahead of everything. And the fact that Brazil is a country with a very high dilution of power among several stakeholders makes compromise an obligatory thing for successes to happen in Brazil. And this is something that the president does not want and does not understand. So every time that he sees that the challenge from the Congress in his measures and the challenge from the judiciary system on his words, he has been very effective, inspired in many ways by Trump, in being able to convince a large part of the population that the problem of lack of execution does not lie with him, but it lies with Congress and the judiciary system. So it became much more a government of intentions instead of a government of executions. And having this behavior confuses the society when the society treats intentions as executions. So the popularity comes much more from what he would like to do, but he never did, compared to what he actually does. And this is a point of related to COVID as well.
Thank you very much, Thiago. Just one question, then I want to go to Jonathan and Fiona and others as well. But the main issue that incoming President Biden has mentioned with respect to Brazil, and there are others, is clearly climate change in the Amazon. We know what President Bolsonaro's feeling about that has been. If you were advising President Biden as to how to deal with that, or if you were just to give the odds of President Biden's success in trying to get something out of Bolsonaro on climate change, how would you advise, or how would you assess? How would you do a risk analysis of that one?
Well, first of all, foreign policy, different than domestic policy, is one of the only areas of politics that can be solved by a phone call. A phone call has the power to stabilize any relationship between two countries in foreign affairs and international affairs. So all it takes is a very sincere, pragmatic, and direct conversation. However, Brazil is not one of the top 15 or 20 priorities for the United States, although the United States is one of the top 2 priorities for Brazil. So this has to come from Brazil towards the US and not vice versa. The United States will always have a reactive approach towards Brazil and not a proactive approach unless the Brazilian president speaks publicly, loudly, either towards issues that directly contradict the views of Biden or against Biden himself. What I would recommend is that before any hard, strong narrative which is made publicly, there always must be an attempt for a pragmatic narrative within the same subject and within the same target goal made in private. Any president can call any president at any time. And this is what I believe that should be made in this particular sense. Biden is more party-oriented than Trump. So this adds an additional risk for Bolsonaro, because when you have members of the Democratic Party in the caucuses, in the committees, in the Congress, launching a motion or a position towards a specific action from the Brazilian government, it is likely that Biden will endorse that. And the miscomprehension from the Brazilian government of how these opinions are made could generate a more aggressive response from the Brazilian side, generating a never-ending cycle. This has to be interrupted, but the responsibility to interrupt that has to come from Brazil. However, Biden can support that by enhancing the diplomatic approach, both in Washington as in Brasilia, developing safe and secure and transparent channels of communication in which the Brazilian side can feel comfortable that they can express their dissatisfactions without the risk of this becoming public. And as the conversation becomes more direct, we could reach solutions in that. Regarding the environment, all it takes is for the Brazilian president to clearly assess what is being made by his side in terms of protecting and managing the environment. However, this cannot only be made through narrative because it's something that it's easily mensurated. You can always see if what you're saying is actually what you're being doing. And for this to be successful, Brazil has to take the forefront. One of the ideas that they had last year, but it never went through, is to have a special ambassador, both in the United States as in the European Union, only dedicated to environmental issues, to discuss this. This was an idea that went to the highest levels of the Brazilian government, but because they are drowned by emotions, and when you have emotions dictating your decisions in the short term, these ideas, they do not prosper. I believe that the view and the perception of Bolsonaro that the elections were rigged in the United States creates a barrier for any sort of conversation with Biden in relation to any topic. And since he does not have any strategic view of the depth of the relationships between Brazil and the US, which is not only in governmental level, but in the financial sector, within the industries, within the private sector, the largest American companies are established in Brazil. Netflix, Microsoft, all those companies, they make a lot of money in Brazil. They are the backbone of the relationship between the two countries. And perhaps if I would suggest Biden using the Chamber of Commerce or the CEO groups of the United States to influence the CEO groups of Brazil, which includes several supporters of Bolsonaro, to transmit messages that otherwise, if sent directly by Biden, would be considered to be threats.
Thank you very much, Thiago. Okay, let's bring some others into this conversation. Jonathan, there's a number of issues I wanted to raise. One is essentially the basic about Brazil's path forward as an investor, how you see it, and also the question about the status of the economic reform agenda. Is it taxes, fiscal reform, privatization? That's a question that we received from the audience. Do you take as much of that? And I'll throw in the announcement that Ford is pulling out of manufacturing out of Brazil. So there's a whole big economic package for you to tackle. Take it away.
Okay. Well, I won't tackle alone, but let me maybe make a couple of comments that I hope are helpful. First of all, I listened carefully to Thiago's comments, and it is both a nuanced and highly compelling narrative that he is expressing. What I would say is that while I cannot dispute any of the points that Thiago has made, we're sitting here in Toronto with capital to go into assets like infrastructure and natural resources. We have to accept the highly imperfect nature of the Brazilian political economy, which is not going to become miraculously any good anytime soon. But is it sufficient? And as it relates to this particular crisis and this particular time, Brazil, for whatever reason, I have a few ideas as to why, Brazil is an attractive target. And the reason it's an attractive target is because it has demonstrated a very rapid return in terms of industrial production, the fastest of the entire world, actually, from the depths of COVID. Number two, it has regained consumer confidence to pre-March of 2020 levels in the shortest period of time of any country in emerging markets, other than China. I don't consider it an emerging market, to be honest. And three, because the rightward shift in the policy framework and the political framework is here for another decade. So, and that's not because they're so great, it's because the other guys are so bad. So, that's the fundamental reality. So when you have to understand the depth of the competition for real assets in the world is so intense. They're not making new countries anytime soon, particularly not ones with 200 million people in them, and that have a very low level of development compared to countries of similar size of a higher income. So the fact that Brazil once again, and even if Guedes only accomplishes half of what he is trying to through the privatization agenda, it is the single largest opportunity in real assets on the planet in history. So, this is how an investor thinks about this. Now, is it all sweetness and light? No. Is the fiscal condition deteriorated? Significantly. Is the productivity of the Brazilian economy and its ultimate growth path that robust? Not really. But it is through that lens that we have to think about Brazil. I just make one small further point, and that is, I do believe that there is a new cultural more about anti-inflation and fiscal rectitude in Brazil. And I absolutely believe on its face that when the government indicates that there is a political consensus around the cliff events on retracting the stimulus as soon as it possibly can, I believe very strongly that actually will happen. There is a consensus, and depending on your view of who's going to be lower house speaker, I happen to think it'll be Lira. I still, even under Rossi, I still think that basic consensus will hold, and that's all we're really looking for. Yes, the currency will be weaker, and yes, there will be a very slow normalization of rates, but that's true in the United States as well.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Everybody wants in on this one, which I don't blame them. Fiona, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think Brazil is a really interesting case. And if we look back at what we were saying about Mexico, in our forecast among the major economies, Mexico will be the slowest to return to pre-COVID levels of real GDP. And Brazil will be the first. And we expect that, for example, for most of the Latin America 6, so the big economies in Latin America, by the end of this year, they'll still be somewhere sort of around 5% below pre-pandemic levels, which is a lot, except for Brazil, which will be close to pre-pandemic levels of development and of real GDP. So you have this really sort of in the short term positive story, which is driven by some positive factors and some negative factors. So obviously the huge fiscal stimulus, which the amount was very important, and also the form and the quality of that fiscal support. So those direct transfers to consumers, they did the job, and they did the job very well. So that was a positive development. But then on the other hand, you had this unprecedented sort of sacrifice in terms of health outcomes in order to produce some of this economic result. So it's a real conundrum there, but you can't deny that Brazil, the economic picture in the short term, looks positive. I do believe that there is a lot of risk to the Brazilian policy outlook that centers around the politics and all of the problems that Thiago was talking about, and a lot of sort of factors that I've mentioned in the past about sort of policy effectiveness, pork barrel politics, political fragmentation in Brazil, and sort of ultimately we can see Bolsonaro has become what he railed against in that regard in terms of political fragmentation and pork barrel politics. He is now sort of relying on the Central. And we know that the Central is not ideological. You know, we can say that policy, yes, it's shifting towards the right or away from the left in any case, and that should be positive for policy, except to the extent that it's driven by the Central. If it is driven by the Central, then they don't really have a big sort of ideological stance. They're not that interested. So I think there are a lot of questions on the part of the Central and on the part of Bolsonaro himself about sort of a commitment to that agenda. And we can see that agenda has already been dramatically watered down. Of course, that's because of COVID. It is positive. We still expect to see some sort of moderate reforms. For example, we expect to see that sort of revenue neutral tax reform pass. Maybe we'll see some sort of privatizations, not sort of the big assets, but we'll see some progress in that arena. So there are sort of reasons to be positive in that regard. But broadly speaking, because of the complicated politics and the lack of policy effectiveness that have sort of held Brazil back, you know, for decades, we are sort of relatively you know, less optimistic about the medium to long term economic outlook for Brazil, which, as Jonathan says quite rightly, that doesn't mean that you won't have investors that are interested in Brazil. Of course they will. It's the biggest market in Latin America. It represents the biggest opportunity. It's a market because of demographic factors that you will want to be in if you're a market-seeking investor, for example. So there are a lot of reasons why we will see sort of significant levels of investment in Brazil above and beyond any other economy in Latin America. Nonetheless, in terms of the GDP outturn, we expect after that initial rebound for the sort of economic outlook to be somewhat less positive.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Shannon, I know you have to drop off for a previously scheduled engagement, so I want to give you a chance to intervene now on Brazil. There's the economic aspects, but you know, I think particularly with respect to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Thiago's conversation about how President Biden might deal with President Bolsonaro and Brazil, and specifically on an issue that's very, very key to the Biden platform, which is climate change and the environment. And of course, anything else you want to comment on?
Sure. So, I mean, one risk I see for Brazil in the year to come is getting caught in what's going to happen internationally. And I think there's two sides to that. So one is sort of the US-China tensions and how that plays out in this, you know, quote unquote decoupling that's happening. And right, so that is 5G networks, that is the hardware that you put in there. And I don't think we're going to see a change when the Democrats come in. If you go to Washington, it is a bipartisan issue, this hardening of the way the national security view on this kind of hardware. And it's not just in the United States, it is also increasingly in Europe, right? We saw the UK go that way, but we've seen many other nations start to move that way. So I think Brazil will be one of the countries potentially caught in deciding between China on one side and the US and Europe, or parts of Europe as well, and sort of where it comes down. And if you do put in Chinese infrastructure in terms of telecoms and the like, then will you have access to a lot of international flows of data and other sorts of things in ways that could be quite harmful for the economy? So I think, and Brazil's going to get caught between the two of this. The other issue I guess I would bring up is, you know, the environmental issues and the Amazon are obviously going to be a tension with the Biden administration, but the Biden administration is not going to be alone on this. And back to Fiona's point about multilateralism, I mean, one of the tenets of a Biden foreign policy is that you're going to act in concert. And we've already seen the EU tensions with Brazil over Mercosur and pushing forward the trade deal right around this Amazon issue. So again, it's not just going to be a US Brazil or a Biden Bolsonaro issue. It is going to be with the EU, which is a big trading partner, with the US as a big trading partner. And back to something that Thiago said, I mean, I do think that CEOs are a conduit potentially, but this also might be where Brazil is pressured. And we've already seen this on the EU side where, you know, H&M and others say they're going to stop sourcing from Brazil because of the Amazon, worried about the leather coming in and the like. I think you could start seeing the reputational risk of international companies working in Brazil if the Amazon is under threat, that, that has nothing to do with, there's nothing to do with Biden, has nothing to do with, the EU, what's going on in Brussels. That has to do with sort of a larger ramification. And so I think 2021 could be a year when Brazil gets caught between these bigger global themes. So it's not just about bilateral relations, it's sort of these bigger global themes, both at the government level, but then also the way the private sector is reacting to the changing policy landscape.
Thank you very much. Shannon, Thiago, do you want to comment? And thank you very much for your participation, Shannon. We'll see you next year and sooner than that, I'm sure. Thiago, did you want to respond to what you heard? And then, first before Thiago, if you give me 1 second, Eduardo, you've been waiting patiently. I know there was a comment that you wanted to make about Brazil. Eduardo? You're on mute, Eduardo.
Sorry, to balance out a little bit my last negative comment. I think as Jonathan said, there's a changing consensus in Brazil that some of the big challenges of the country have to be addressed. And some of them are both the country's curse and its opportunity. I would say, for example, one of the things that allowed the country to rebound that strongly from this crisis was the size of its government. Brazil's government is about 1.5 times larger than the rest of Latin America. And it's fairly effective at channeling resources, and that was very positive. But if you go forward and the challenges for Brazil, that needs to be addressed. Why? Because even though it's a much larger government, it doesn't have better results in terms of what matters for the long term, which is educational achievement, infrastructure quality, and things that allow the country to grow faster for longer. So Brazil has to address that. But I would say for this year, I actually think Brazil may be one of the stars in the region. To John's point question from earlier, even though this year Mexico benefited from being the kind of the hawkish central bank in the region, for Mexico, there's no central bank rate hikes priced in for the next 2 years by markets. Chile, one of the second most hawkish one, is only expected to hike about 100 basis points. For Brazil, markets are already discounted 5.5 points of interest rate increases. That combined with Brazil having underperformed so badly last year, the real was basically 15% weaker than the rest of the regional currencies in 2020. I think Brazil will have a big boost in capital flows into it from these sources. On top of that, some of the inflation problems we're seeing now, I think, have to do with the government stimulus. The government was very aggressive giving households a lot of money, but that ends now in January. And whereas last year we had a little bit of a bottleneck problem where supply was disrupted, and we had a very strong surge in demand from these household stimulus, I think the inflation problem in Brazil will tend to correct itself. That combined with the central bank validating that kind of hawkish stance, I think means Brazil probably has a very strong year this year. So with that, I'll leave it for the rest.
Well, that was positive. Good for you, Eduardo. Thiago, I know you have to leave, but you have the last word. In a minute or two, is there anything you want to add to what you've heard?
Well, what I want to add is that first, the economic reforms, it's a sort of problem that everyone wants to approve. Everyone knows that it's on track, but people don't know how to do it. And who does not know how to do is the executive. The lack of knowledge about the Congress makes the members of the executive believe that the Congress serves the executive. And they are not an equal power for that, and that's a big mistake. The construction of the reforms must be made together between the Ministry of Economy and these stakeholders inside the executive, inside the Congress. And unless this happens, and Bolsonaro has a wrong view of loyalty, he believes that by supporting a specific candidate or a specific group within the Congress, this is enough for them to simply validate everything that comes from the government. And this is not the fact. This is wrong. I believe we're going to have a tax reform approved before the middle of the year. An administrative reform, I'm more skeptical to that. I'm also very skeptical to the capability of the government to move forward with the privatizations, mostly because of the difficulties in leading and negotiating with very different interlocutors. And I believe that Bolsonaro will keep governing through by the hour, by mobilizing his base, distributing guilt and blames towards others. And the most important aspects will be decided by the Congress, transforming Brazil in a sort of semi-parliamentary system.
Thank you very much, Thiago. Again, like Mexico, Brazil, we could spend a lot more time talking about it, and we will in a separate event. But at this point, I think we need to move on to the next. Thank you, Thiago, for your participation on this, and introduce Claudia Heiss, who's the Director, Institute of Public Affairs, University of Chile. I think, Claudia, you're with us right now, are you not?
Yes, here I am.
Oh, great. Welcome back to CCA webinars. Claudia, why don't you start us off for a few minutes giving an overview of where you see Chile headed politically. Obviously, there's the Constitutional Convention, elections coming up, and then, of course, there's the issue of how does it get out of the COVID economically. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. So the bad news is that we are right now living a second wave of the COVID. So we are already as bad in as bad shape as we were in June, in the middle of the winter. And we have 4,000 contagions a day. Intensive care units are almost at full capacity right now. And it's very difficult to maintain confinement in summer vacations. So it's been a very difficult moment, also because we went from confinement to an opening that also activated the economy in the last months. So this is a setback that is proving very difficult to maintain. There was a relaxation of confinement measures since August, and that led to economic recovery, a recovery of employment, and so now we are moving backwards. And as you mentioned, we had a very strong political crisis in 2019, the outburst of October 2019, that triggered a constitution-making process. The political system reacted to this social mobilization, offering the people the solution of opening a process to change the Pinochet constitution that we have maintained since the return to democracy. But I think that's it's a good sign that the political system was able to react to the outburst and offered an institutional exit to the crisis. But of course, we started the economic crisis with that outburst before the economic crisis of the COVID. So we went from the crisis of the social protests in 2019 to the crisis of COVID. The president now has 7% support. It's the lowest support the president has had in Chile since we measure these things. And its COVID policy was initially herd immunity. We had a very bad management of the pandemic in the beginning. I think that has improved. And as Jonathan was saying before, the rebound growth in Asia is a reason for optimism in Chile. So I think the current mood in Chile in economic terms is optimistic because copper is very high. We reach a very high price of copper. The dollar is low, 350 is the price of copper. And in spite of political turmoil, the government and the opposition were able to reach an agreement regarding an emergency increase in public expenditure until 2022. So there was a lot of political debate to approve the budget in the end of 2020. And in spite of all the fragmentation and all the political disputes, there was an economic agreement to increase public expenditure temporarily. And also, as I mentioned before, there are signs of employment recovery. And so the big question regarding the development of the economy is the evolution of the pandemic. We are already vaccinating some people. Chile has vaccines, but in very small amounts, only for the health personnel. But we have a relatively good health national system that, as long as we can have access to more vaccines, could be effective. So I think growth will depend on the evolution of COVID and the level of confinement required. And I think the political, in spite of all the instability that we have now and all the questions that are open, the political process is positive because instability is bad for business, but illegitimate institutions are a cause of instability. So I think that constitution making is an institutional response to the social demands that could help rebuild legitimacy and create more stability for the future. Probably that would mean a reduction of inequality, an increase in social protection, and but I think that's the price to rebuild trust in institutions and to create a more solid and stable democracy.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for starting us off. Fiona, did you want to jump in?
Sure. Just to say that I completely agree, and I'm cautiously optimistic on Chile. I know that there is some debate, and in some quarters there may be concern about the investment environment and the uncertainty that the constitutional reform process is going to bring with it. But I am optimistic because Chile has the institutional capacity to actually resolve all of these issues that were sort of that became very clear with the social unrest in late 2019. It has sort of an institutional path to address those. And apart from that, more than any other country in Latin America, it has the fiscal capacity to address these issues as well. And already, Piñera is extremely unpopular, but his government has attempted to sort of put together a reform agenda that's completely different from the agenda that it came into office with. So there is sort of an acceptance among politicians more broadly of the need for change and the fiscal capacity to make that happen. And for that reason, sort of, I'm optimistic about Chile's prospects. Clearly, the process in the very short term will have a somewhat negative impact on investment, both domestic and foreign. And for that reason, we expect that perhaps in one quarter this year, Chile, in terms of the recovery, will actually go backwards in terms of sequential growth quarter on quarter. So there will be some uncertainty, but I think that, as Claudia says, that's a small price to pay for Chile really leading the way in this effort to try to address all of those issues that across Latin America were triggers for social unrest, sort of economic malaise, income inequality, social deficiencies. So I think Chile's really leading the way here. I think what we have to look at, if we want to sort of drill down a little bit more closely, is, for example, the makeup of the Constituent Assembly. And there are questions as to, for example, voter turnout and participation, and whether or not that will increase in the election for the Constituent Assembly, and if it does not, what that might mean for the makeup of the Assembly, and whether or not the Assembly is representative of the population overall, and therefore produces something that has a lot of buy-in by the Chilean population, but actually represents what the Chilean population is demanding going forward. So that's the sort of the risk, the longer term risk there is that it is what actually the process itself produces. And also, I guess, thinking apart from the constitutional reform process, the presidential election itself, and we've seen this increasing political polarization, and whether or not we see a very big shift away from this sort of broad consensus around economic orthodoxy. So I think that is the big risk on the part of investors about whether or not that will be lost, and you'll throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, it's interesting, Fiona, when the riots happened in the fall of 2019 in private conversations, although I think they would say it publicly, that, the relevant ministers were all saying, we were so focused on having the prettiest balance sheet, we forgot to actually focus on what the needs of the people were. And so there was definitely seems to be an epiphany initially, maybe a forced epiphany, but an epiphany nonetheless amongst them, away from the orthodoxies, as you just mentioned.
And a pretty balance sheet is a good thing. Make no mistake, Argentina would love to have that. Yeah. But it's not enough. Right. Correct.
Well, that certainly was what they came to. Jonathan, I know you would like to come in on this one, please.
Yeah. So at the risk of having a love-in for Chile, I did want to say that there are a couple of things that that do strike me as quite positive, both for the time being and also longer term, with one caveat. first of all, just getting to some of the nitty gritty, Chile is a standout, one of the countries that's going to benefit most from the rebound in China. So copper is very much in demand. It is a new, as in addition to old economy commodity, it's a wonderful thing to have. And they have, you know, a turnkey kind of relationship with China economically, which in this particular set of circumstances is very positive. So I expect that the economy will grow. I mean, Eduardo may have a slightly different number, but at least, you know, 4.5–5% this coming year, and probably not much less the next year. So that's a very strong recovery, and that will definitely help from a GDP to debt to GDP point of view. The second point is, in a way, the pristine balance sheet was for this very epochal time, and I know, good for them for holding on. They probably held on too long and a little bit too tight. Okay, that's what happens when you have people from Chicago running the place. But nonetheless, this is what it's been used for. The third point I'd make is, boy, to have an opportunity, and I loved your comment, Claudia, about the institutional response. I'd love to have an opportunity as a Latin American country to rewrite my constitution in 2021 instead of 1988. You know, as Brazil did, and put in all sorts of crazy stuff, that promising the star and the moon to everyone. This is a practical people with I think in the end will be a very practical constitutional set of promises at the right level of aggregation, the right altitude, with the right balance between responsibility and equality, and freedom. And, you know, it's just a better time to be doing that in straightened era, as opposed to one of rising expectations. So I think these are all putting Chile in a really strong position. It is a nation that can pull together, but riots are useful, right? I mean, they're devastating, and they cause grievous harm, but they do remind people, and this is what they're for. And I think they did what they were supposed to do, essentially wake up the elite, which is clearly, as Fiona said, way past and far from their moorings ideologically, to get sort of something done practically here. And that's positive. The one caveat is what is a great thing in the short term also can be a challenge, and that is China. The China dilemma for Chile, I think, is something that will become deeper as the bifurcation of not just the technology world, but really the whole of the economic landscape bifurcates between China and the United States, or however you want to describe those camps. And I think Chile will be confronted with the question of China as an economic partner and as a diplomatic partner. And I think that's something that's going to have to contend with. My guess is that neutrality, which is a tried and true strategy in Chile, will ultimately prevail. But I think there'll be some stresses and strains that come along with that.
Thank you, Jonathan. We were running a little bit behind, but Claudia, I did want to give you the last word, responding to anything that anybody else had said, or anything else briefly that have come to your mind.
Just very shortly, I wanted to add that even though this had a sort of revolutionary moment that triggered this constitution making, the rules that regulate the process are already set in the constitution. So they were regulated through constitutional reform, and this constitutional reform has some very interesting features. One of them is that it commands gender parity in the constitution-making body. So this will automatically increase, I think, the legitimacy of the representation of the Constituent Convention. Chile had a very low political participation of women until this Congress. We only have 15% of women in Congress, which is low even for Latin America. So even though we had a woman president, we've had very few women in politics, and I think that's very important. And also, we just recently passed a norm that will have 17 of the members of the convention represent indigenous peoples, which have been completely absent from political life. So this is really a very big change from political representation before. And I think one of the problems that led to this crisis is that our representative system is not really representative. It's it excludes many groups in society. So I think that the gender parity, the presence of indigenous people, and also the fact that all the norms will need to be approved by 2/3. So the requirement is very high to put something in the constitution. So that will guarantee that you will not have extreme positions in the constitution. It's going to force convergence. So I think those three are elements that should tranquilize or calm down people who think this is like, the burning of the Bastille or like something that will really lead us to the end of Chile or Chilezuela, as they like to scare Chilean people.
Thank you, Claudia. And I would recommend to our listeners who want to know more about this process to look on our website to the webinar we did. It was October, November, right? Claudia was one of it, was actually talk about inclusion. The panel was all women, and we talked specifically about the constitutional process in Chile. Again, you can find it at our website at ccacanada.com. Thank you very much, Claudia. We'd like to talk more about Chile, like the countries, but we have to move on to Colombia at this point. Thank you very much for your great contributions. And now, as we move to Claudia, I'd like to bring in from Claudia. I'd like to move to Sergio Guzman, who's director and co-founder of Colombia Risk Analysis. Sergio, you're there, are you not?
I am here. Ken, how are you?
Well, I'm fine, and thank you for all your patience. I'm running a little bit behind, but you've been listening the whole time. We appreciate it. You always have a lot to say in your reports, in your podcasts, and your interviews. Student analyst of Colombia. Can you give us 5 minutes about where Colombia may be going in 2021?
Well, I wish I had a little bit more than 5 minutes, to be honest, but I'll do my best, and I'll do my best also to turn on my camera. That for some reason it's not working at the moment. So I think Colombia is in a bind, both politically, socially, and economically. I think the government is looking at 2020 as a year that's mostly discarded as so to speak, a year to be forgotten. Colombia had its worst year on record economically. People estimate that it's going to have a contraction of 7.7% of its GDP year on year. Unemployment reached a high level of 21% back in May. It's stabilized since then to 13% currently. And I think that's a relief from where it could have been. But I guess at the same time, the government, like many other governments in the rest of the world, has been unable to contain the rise of the COVID-19 infections. And I think that's very concerning, because Colombia's plan had been to have some of the world's longest quarantines and strictest quarantines, and which were to be phased out in September to lead way to an economic reopening. And unfortunately for the government, now that it's reopening and it has a second peak, it's basically bound itself not to enact strict quarantines again. And so this is inevitably going to cause irritation and tension between the central government and the local governments, particularly the cities of Cali, Medellin, and Bogota. And so I think that tension between the national government and the local administrations, which was a big part of 2020, is going to go on to 2021 with a bigger risk going forward, which is we have elections in 2022. And I think Colombia, unlike Peru, which you're going to talk about, Chile that you talked about, and Ecuador that some others talked about, is lucky in that it doesn't have elections in 2021. It does have a lot to lose if 2021 doesn't go in the government's directions, at least in the contagion and in the economic sense. And I think that looking at the economy, the government is in a bind, because, as I mentioned, I think one of the biggest problems is the government needs to stimulate the economy, but its revenue position is so weak that unless it's able to raise significant amounts of revenue this year, either through a tax reform or through the sale of government assets, it's going to find itself in a deficit that's going to merit a downgrade that some people are saying is imminent. And that is very concerning. Like Eduardo and others have mentioned, some believe that this has already been priced in to government bond sales and government government issuances, both this year and last year. But I think it's also a reason for concern because neither option is politically palatable for the government, especially because the government said this is for the first time any government ever in its last year in office decides to launch into a tax reform effort. And I think that that's concerning because the public is well aware, and the politicians especially are well aware, that anybody who votes in favor of a tax reform is going to have a very tough time selling their agenda 6 or 8 months later to the general public. And so that makes Plan A, tax reform, that extends the value-added tax for basic consumption goods and reduces corporate preferences and some VAT refunds, not very viable. And on the second front, the sale of government assets is a more politically appealing solution. However, it has some long-term downsides, which is that the government loses on that potential revenue from currently profitable assets, such as ISA, such as Ecopetrol, such as Cenit, etc. So it's not a really appealing dilemma that the government has to face currently. And I think that that's very concerning. On the, and you talked about the foreign policy, and I'll comment on that as well. I think Colombia is in a very complex place geopolitically, because it has a neighbor that is essentially a failed state and a dictatorship now in Venezuela, with zero remorse from the Maduro government that is now completely co-opted all state functions. We have the government of Russia being much more active in its efforts to attack the Colombian government figuratively and also politically through its information and disinformation campaigns. A number of spies were expelled from Russia that were present in Colombia. And so it's not too, we can expect Russia to also launch operations in Colombia facing the 2022 elections. And I think that that's concerning because Colombia is not at the same level of play in terms of statecraft than Russia is, at least in the geopolitical sense. And then we have China, who has a large appetite for Colombian assets. China's already bought into the metro project in Bogotá, the Tren de Cercanías project in Cundinamarca, and Colombia's largest gold mine in Buriticá. And I think China's appetite for Colombian assets is not going to reduce. However, at the same time, it's been met by resistance from the US, that's our biggest partner and ally geopolitically and economically and otherwise, from engaging in that economic relationship with China. Under a Biden administration, that may change. That may not be as aggressive, but I don't think the U.S. efforts to counter Chinese influence has been accompanied necessarily with American investment. And so even though the United States, through its new Development Finance Corporation, has attempted to give Colombia more than $10 billion in loans, Colombia at the moment doesn't need any more loans. I think it's an overextended and over-leveraged country in that sense. And so although it's compatible with U.S. interests, I think the U.S. needs to be way more generous with Colombia. I should also add, as should other countries globally, because Colombia has received 1.8 million Venezuelan citizens. Colombia has tackled shouldered the majority of the financial burden of the upkeep of those immigrants, and that permanence of many of those immigrants in Colombia and elsewhere in Latin America is likely to be followed by bouts of xenophobia or bouts of intolerance towards immigration that we're already beginning to see. And I don't know the types of consequences that may have in the medium term. I think finally, and to point out two issues that are very close to my heart, and I know yours too, Ken, Colombia has a very ambitious environmental agenda. And I think that that is compatible with President-elect Biden's agenda for the Americas. But it's been very difficult for President Duque to actually enact that environmental agenda, since it puts him at odds in a large part with many of his strongest constituencies, which represent large landholders, large cattle ranchers, etc. And so making some of those ambitious pledges, as the government has done, is good, at least from a PR standpoint. Having those come to reality is going to bring very large headaches to President Duque. And then finally, I want to remark, if you'll allow me, on the security situation in rural areas, because Colombia has had a very complex security environment devolution since the peace agreement was signed. And I don't want to put the blame or the responsibility on President Duque's disregard for the peace agreement that was signed between the government and the FARC by his predecessor, President Santos. But the state did have a very large delay in filling the vacuums of power that were left by the FARC after they retrenched from different parts of the country. And that absence of state presence gave way to a lot of illegal groups that continue profiting from coca production, from illegal mining, and from contraband in many cases. And although the government's been very firm and adamant that it will fight narco trafficking, the tools that it's chosen to do so may be counterproductive, in particular aerial fumigation. And I hope that Sharon would be here for us to discuss that, because she just wrote a marvelous report for the United States Congress, talking about what the different avenues for President Duque and for the Colombian government to enact in terms of U.S. policy towards drug eradication. And I think we need to look at those recommendations as a roadmap. But those recommendations are only going to be as good as the political will of the government to see them through. And I think that that's where we are at an impasse, because I think that the Duque government promoted and to a large degree staked its reputation on its ability to deliver aerial fumigation, and it's going to come up short. So I hope that that was a sufficiently succinct summary of what's going on in Colombia, and it's a real pleasure to be with all of you today.
Thank you, Sergio. Yeah, and there's the whole issue in the rural areas of the ongoing killing of the social leaders, which the government has just not been able to get its arms around, assuming it has wanted to get its arms around it, and how that might fuel a reignition of the social discontent that was bubbling shortly before COVID hit. Jonathan, I know you need to drop off soon, so I'm going to give you the last word on this. Would you like to say something?
I don't have much to add. I must say, just make a couple of comments. I do need to step off, and I did want to thank all the panelists for joining us today. And it has been I'm looking at the feedback on the Q&A in the chat, and I think there's been a lot of strong positive feedback. So I really appreciate everyone taking time to do this. My only comment on Colombia is that it is a striking a contrast to the tradition in Colombia towards both conservatism and practicality in the face of very serious externalities. And it is one of the Q&A incidentally was asking about the potential for downgrades, and I reluctantly but unfortunately quite factually have to say that if there's one place that's likely to lose its investment grade rating first among Latin American countries, it's Colombia. And that's a shocking thing to say, given how hard the country fought to both get and retain its investment grade rating, based on a history of course, never conducting a default. So this is, I think, an axiomatic time. And I think the political economy of Colombia has caught up with it in some respects. And these sort of proxies are important. They're indicative of potentially an inflection point in the country's trajectory. But anyway, I must depart. But thank you again, Sergio, for taking part. Great comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Sergio. Peru. We're going to move to Alexandra Ames. Alexandra, can you start us off talking a little bit about where Peru is going economically coming out of COVID? And of course, we have presidential elections coming up in a few months. So there's more than enough to start us off there, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, thank you, Ken. So Peru has been one of the Latin American countries that had the hardest hit during the pandemic crisis. The weakness of our institutions and the limited capacity of our bureaucracy made possible to us to be one of the countries in the world with the highest mortality per million people, and at the same time with a very strong downturn of the economy. We are a country with a 70% of informality, so we don't have strong social security systems. Most of the families in Peru are very vulnerable, so we have a media class with a high risk to fall into poverty. For decades, we have been a prosperous country, but we haven't been able to traduce our economic growth into social progress. We won't be able to traduce our economic success in social success, into quality of life to all citizens. So our inequality is very high. So this is why many people lost their jobs during the pandemic. We closed the markets and then our economy collapsed. And unfortunately, we have 3 million people that became poor this year or last year. So now we have more than 10 million people who live in poverty. And that means that is the 30% of our population. So that set us back 10 years back in our fight against poverty. So in Peru, we didn't have a health crisis. It was also an economic crisis that soon turned into a political crisis. The whole 2020, we have political destabilization, and in November, our democratic system broke. So during 2020, we have 3 presidents, and one of them lasted less than a week. So this change of events brought uncertainty and despair to the people. So the bad relationship between the legislative and the executive powers brought chaos and ungovernability. So this is a clear example of our institutional deficiency. And also our income grew, so as our optimism, but we fell into, we call the middle quality institutional trap, because Peru's decision makers failed to strengthen our institutions, and this is what we really need to strengthen institutions is what we really need to make a better country, a better society. So to recover the economy, we need to know that first of all, we need to know that we have to realize that the crisis, the shocks, the economic shocks are going to keep coming. So this time we have to be prepared. So it's not enough to think about how to recover the economy, but it's more important how to become our economy growth, or how to traduce our economy growth into social progress to all the people. So we have to change our mindset. So in Peru, Peru's main workforce belongs to the MSME sector. So most of these enterprises, small enterprises, micro enterprises, are not formal because laws and regulations are not convenient for them. So we need to target this sector, and we need to increase the productivity and the competitiveness of this sector if we want to develop our economy and fight against poverty at the same time. So we need to recover our economy. Of course, we need that, but also we need to do that in a bottom-up strategy.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I I want to bring in Fiona into this, and Eduardo as well. And maybe in addition to touching on the economic, there could be a little bit of a discussion is what you see or the panelists see coming out, or the prognosis for the elections coming up this spring, because Alexandra, you mentioned the the government instability, certainly politically, and many people think that they keep seeing this over and over and over in Peru, unfortunately, and whether or not there's a path forward, and whether the upcoming presidential election somehow gives some hope of bringing more stability than we've seen over the last little while. Fiona, did you want to jump in now?
Sure. So on Peru, politically, somewhat pessimistic, at least about the prospects for there, for example, being sort of a decline in political fragmentation and a better working Congress that works well with the executive. We do on balance think in terms of sort of the policy stance of the incoming Congress that it's probably more likely to be, or it is on balance most likely to be centrist, because of the parties that were sort of anti-impeachment were sort of centrist parties, and we expect that those parties might do well. However, having said that, I think there's a lot of risk associated with the presidential election, and a risk, or maybe it won't happen in this presidential election, but it will happen in future to Peru, because we always talk about how Peru is very unstable politically, but very stable and relatively well functioning economically. But that won't always be the case. And I think, I can't remember what the opinion poll was, but I recently saw an opinion poll that said that an increasing proportion of the population is now identifying as either to the right or to the left rather than centrist. And that suggests that there is polarization, and that we will see a move away from this sort of acceptance of the economic orthodoxy that's been in place since Alan Garcia's first term ended and Fujimorismo came in. Even Alan Garcia's second term sort of accepted that orthodoxy and those policies. Ollanta Humala as well, accepted, sort of an element of that sort of policy. We didn't ever really see a big shift in that policy, but that's not to say that it won't ever happen, just because it's been a long while. And this is the sort of event, this sort of crisis, and this goes, of course, for all of Latin America, but this is going to be transformational. And there are big sort of problems that Alexandra, is quite right to mention in terms of, for example, social progress. And we could see that creating big changes in the political environment in Peru. It might not happen, but it might not happen by April, and it's really difficult to say because the polls don't really tell us much, and a lot happens in Peruvian elections at the last minute, right? So you really just have to look from here on out who's building momentum. So we don't know that for sure, but I just don't think that we can be so positive about this fact that Peru will always have good policies economically. I did wanted to mention in this regard. There was a reform to sort of agrarian and incentive policies that were undertaken at the end of last year in response to social protests. And I think that that's fair, that those incentives probably always should have been temporary. But I think on the part of investors, you might see some nervousness around the possibility that there might be sort of future policy adjustments that would be negative for business that are in response to those social demands. So I think that there is, if investors perceive that to be a risk, then that would be negative for investment and therefore the economy's growth prospects. On the positive side, I think there's something that I wanted to mention, and that is around John at the very beginning of this discussion was talking about sort of the hit to consumers and to incomes, and the fact that we were having an incomplete recovery in employment across the region, including in Peru. Alexandra mentioned that as well. And so I think we need to look at something that that Peru is doing in this regard. And I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's certainly something to watch, and whether or not it works well or not. And that is that Peru has shifted from the use of those direct transfers that in 2020 were so supportive of consumers, although in Peru's case, they weren't well sort of administered, and so they didn't have a full effect. So although Peru has got a lot of money, it's low debt to GDP, sort of the effect of those was kind of diminished by bureaucratic and institutional inefficiencies. But I think what it's doing now is shifting into public investment in infrastructure. And I think that's something to look out for to see if that works well, because that could have a positive impact, not just on the medium and long-term growth outlook for Peru. We always talk about how Latin America has infrastructural deficiencies that it needs to address, and this would do that. But it also is generating employment, and I think that's really important in Peru as in the rest of the region. So I don't have the answer as to whether or not that will work well, or whether it should stick more with those direct transfers. But like I said, I think it's something to watch, and it could work well in terms of actually trying to support employment, because we know in Peru, as in the rest of the region, even where it's recovering, it's lower quality employment in the informal sector, and that's something that governments, including the Peruvian government, need to address.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And Eduardo and John both want to jump in. We have literally 2-3 minutes, and then we need to move to the Caribbean. Eduardo, do you want to jump in now? You have your mute on, Eduardo.
Thank you. The first thing I would point out is I think one thing that's positive about Peru in this political uncertainty period is it has a little bit of an Italy in it, in that the private sector has learned to live with political uncertainty better than most countries in the region. That's a positive. However, I think a little bit, like I would say in this panel, I've been in line with the optimism towards Chile, on the positive side to Brazil, more positive than most in Colombia. But I would say in Peru, like Mexico, I think there's a huge decision looming, and it has to be determined whether the political class will be up to the challenge. The last two of the great reforms of kind of the social contract in the world have come after pandemics. The Black Death led to the creation of a commercial class and to the kind of a little bit of a land reform. The country that got it right experienced the Renaissance. The other ones remain in the Dark Ages. The next great social reform I would point out was the Spanish pandemic. It led to the creation of welfare states. Countries that made the right choices thrived. Countries that were doing well and got that wrong collapsed. And two of the great examples there were in Latin America, Argentina and Uruguay, countries that were comparable or even wealthier than Canada 50 years ago, massively underperformed because they got the reform wrong. Latin America now in this pandemic faces the choices of getting a social reform right. I would argue that two of the countries in the region that have the best starting point for it are Chile and Peru. Both have very strong fiscal positions, both have higher than regional average domestic savings pools because of the pension fund saving pools they have accumulated. However, it remains to be seen whether the Peruvian seemingly dysfunctional political dynamics right now will be up to the challenge of getting that needed reform, which society will be pressing for right. So I would say in Peru, I would, like in Mexico's case, it's in the court of the relevant authorities to make the right choices in this very difficult point.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. John.
Eduardo raises a really interesting point that I think warrants a discussion at some point. But I just wanted to add the perspective of the mining industry. We work a lot with miners, and they are very concerned, not just with Peru, but probably starting with Peru, by virtue of the fact that gold prices are at very high rates and the fiscal conditions of most host governments, including Peru's, are in dire straits. Peru's political class understands the importance of mining. I don't think they're going to revamp on the contractual obligations they have to maintain royalties where they are, et cetera. However, what we've seen in the past in Peru is when there is an economic crisis, the obligations of the national government to pass on royalties to the state and municipal level of governments, those promises are broken and the money does not pass hands. And those communities are already have a well-justified custom of road blocking mining operations, of protesting, certain abuses that go on. And now if no money is going their way, we're going to see, I think, more conflictive mining operational environments in Peru. And that's troublesome because it's, you know, it hurts Peru's ability to rebound beyond Lima and the coast and rebound in its poorest parts of the country. And why is that important? Because Peruvian politics, with its second round of elections, which has been a stabilizing force, nonetheless has led to several nail-biting presidential elections over the last 20 years. And that vote in the Sierra is often the vote that is more drawn towards a populist thinking. And so if that vote in the Sierra is not getting those transfer payments and is worse off economically, they are going to vote more populist. And so this is not just a purely economic and investment climate issue. This becomes a political issue in the political cycle of Peru.
Thank you very much, John. Alexandra, we're over time, but in 1 minute, did you want to respond to anything you heard from the other panelists?
Yes, thank you. Just a few more minutes. Shortly, at the end of the 2019, the Congress was closed because the congressmen didn't really think about the country, but their own interests. So new elections were called thinking that the new Congress will be better, but it turned out that now it's worse. So I'm not very optimistic about the new Congress that we are going to have in June. So about the elections, we have more than 20 parties. So we have more than 20 candidates running for president, but there's only one that has more than 10% of voting intention, and only two that have more than 5%. More than 17 parties are below 5% of voting intention. So that means that we are going to have a very fragmented, again, and divided Congress, and therefore I don't think there will be a good governability. In social protests, so there was a lot of outrage, so there are no protesters anymore, but activism is going to continue. I think there is going to continue or remain alert, to stay alert. But when we are in an electoral process, our indignations and our demands will be channeled through the proposals of the presidential candidates. So we are just starting the electoral process, so we have to wait what is going to happen. But I'm not very optimistic about good governability between the executive and the parliament.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Thank you for your participation and joining us. I now have to leave and move to Jessica Byron-Reid, who's Director of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. And Jessica, thank you so much for your patience and listening through all of this. Covering the Caribbean is not an easy task. Each of the islands has its own issues, but there are some overarching themes, particularly coming out of COVID, that we had discussed earlier. You and I, would you please give us your thoughts about what we can see in 2021? You're on mute, Jessica. You're still on the mute button. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding me. Good afternoon, everybody. Happy New Year. Now, I don't have a country to speak about, as Ken said, but my remarks will focus on the island Caribbean, Belize, and the Guyanas. Now, in terms of COVID-19, many Caribbean territories have been spared the worst in terms of disease spread or death toll. The Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, in fact, experienced by far the worst health effects of the pandemic. However, for all Caribbean territories, the preventive measures to control the spread of the pandemic have been very damaging, very disruptive to their economies, resulting in projected negative growth for 2020 of at least 8% for the sub-region, and unemployment levels of 12% or much higher. Increased debt levels, external debt levels, which is heartbreaking for some countries like Jamaica, which had worked so hard to bring their debt to GDP ratio down to much more sustainable levels over the last couple of years. And hang on a minute. And many countries have had to have recourse to emergency assistance from the IMF and multilateral banks. And there is going to be a painful period of fiscal adjustment and responding to external conditions. In general, Caribbean countries followed the protocols and guidelines of the WHO and other agencies in responding to the pandemic. So they all used a similar script, more or less, to respond to one of the most critical social and economic crises they'd ever experienced. But there were differences in individual state responses, which depended on national strengths or limitations, the particular political situation each state was facing. And I must tell you that there were 11 national elections during 2020 in the Caribbean. The structure and specific needs of each national economy and the particular international networks and resources that each country could draw on to craft its response and strategy. So, for example, on one side, you have a country like Cuba with a health system system that is based on primary health care and prevention, and which has a high concentration of medical professionals. Cuba was able both to maintain a relatively low infection and death rate and to provide support teams of health professionals to various countries around the world, and to be the only Caribbean country presently developing and testing homegrown COVID-19 vaccines. Some countries that had a bit more fiscal space, for example, Trinidad, have kept their borders closed for much longer periods than other countries. Similarly, while most governments implemented social protection and business support measures, the extent of these depended on the resources available to that country and its social security framework. For example, only Barbados and the Bahamas had the structure to offer unemployment insurance. Most countries with limited health systems relied very heavily on the strategy of border closure and internal lockdowns, but they have faced very high economic costs from implementing such measures. Well, with regard to reopening and recovery efforts, CARICOM countries initially sought to coordinate closely, but differences began to appear given the complexity of the process and their diverse national situations. Given the high dependence on tourism for revenue and employment in many countries, Bahamas, Eastern Caribbean, Belize, and Jamaica, tourism and travel amount to over 25% of GDP and over 30% of employment. So they wanted to reopen borders or relax lockdowns as early as safely possible, driven primarily by economic considerations. But inevitably, of course, the incidence of cases increased, sometimes leading to a later resurgence of the virus and the need for renewed restrictions. And so the region has increasingly realized that recovery and return to normalcy are linked to global as well as local conditions. The Caribbean has the highest overall dependence of any world region on the travel and tourism sector. But also countries with oil and gas sectors, Trinidad, Ghana, Suriname, have suffered from falling demand and plunging prices for their products, although their economic recovery is expected to precede others in the region. Informal sector workers and other vulnerable groups like migrants have suffered the most. Inequality has risen and progress towards achieving the Agenda 2030 SDGs is expected to slow considerably. Regional physical connectivity and cohesion has been very badly affected. No mail services apart from DHL, and very few air or sea routes operating for travelers across the Caribbean. Short-term recovery efforts entail relaunching tourism and travel and entertainment sectors when possible and as sustainably as possible. But the region is also looking forward to eventual access to vaccines as they journey back to normalcy. We have recently been reminded that the COVAX allocation for CARICOM countries only will cover 15% of their populations. COVID-19 has also pushed us into longer-term economic diversification and growth, which is much needed. Much greater digitization of business processes and public administration, delivery of services, the education and health sectors. Food security and the imperative to grow more food, that has become a policy priority at the moment. Domestic agriculture. Many countries are exploring green-blue economy possibilities, expanding the use of renewable energy, and building their capacity for risk management, especially disaster management. And of course, trying to find out every way possible of marketing cultural industries. Now, all of this will depend on the available of loan and investment finance. And so you find the Caribbean has been lobbying very vociferously for access to development capital for middle-income countries and a renewed recognition of the vulnerability index for SIDS. And then you have all sorts of, well, you've had the Canada-Caribbean UN collaboration on development financing, and you have various initiatives for new FDI inflows being used. Excuse me 1 second. I've got to let my nephew in. I'm coming.
Well, while we're waiting, Fiona, do you want to pick up on this and we can come back to Jessica?
Sure.
I am so sorry about that.
Oh, hi, Jessica. We were just
I just wanted to end by saying we can talk about this afterwards.
Yeah.
There are various FDI initiatives that countries have been trying to explore, but I wanted to end by speaking about 3 political crises that the region has faced in 2020. CARICOM played a role in supporting an eventual peaceful democratic outcome to the Guyanese election in March. There are 2 others which are much more intractable. We've spoken about Venezuela already, and also there are events in Haiti. Both these crises are characterized by unpopular governments, challenged legitimacy, hopelessly fragmented opposition forces, and deteriorating living conditions for the population that are causing a constant outflow of migrants. And countries in the Caribbean, for instance, Trinidad and the Netherlands Antilles, have really struggled with their management of the Venezuelan migrant crisis. We heard the Colombian perspective a bit earlier. This has been rendered much more difficult by the effects of the pandemic. And they have also grappled with other dimensions of Venezuela's decline. The Venezuelan crisis and the policies of various external actors have generated deep divisions amongst the CARICOM countries over Venezuela, and it has been very difficult for CARICOM to craft and maintain coherent and unified sub-regional policies. Haiti's latest crisis of governance has simmered since 2018 and may well deteriorate further in 2021 and attract greater levels of regional and international attention. That's it from me. I am so sorry for the interruption.
No, thanks, Jessica. I think my dog you could hear at some point earlier in the proceedings, but thank you very much. I would like to go to Fiona on this to add her comments. Please, Fiona.
Of course. So just briefly on the very short-term outlook, I'm afraid it's quite negative because of all of the factors that Jessica's mentioned, problems accessing the vaccine, reliance on COVAX, and not being allocated very much through the WHO's COVAX facility this year, and also because of the fact that by the time that we might see vaccine progress on vaccinations in the region and also in the rest of the world, that'll be the tourism low season. So we have to look back again until the end of this year, which is the start of the high season again in the Caribbean. So I'm afraid the outlook for 2021, bearing in mind the dependence of the region on tourism, is not sort of is not a great one. But what I really wanted to highlight was first, the Caribbean really is more than any other sub-region in the broad LAC region, the U.S.'s backyard. And I think for the U.S., in terms of the debate around U.S. and China and bifurcation, China has been very active in the Caribbean. And I think that is, for U.S. policymakers, problematic. And I would also say that the Biden administration has a key policy priority that is in line with a Caribbean policy priority, which is efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change and to improve the Caribbean's sort of resilience to the impact of climate change. And I think, that would generate politically a lot of goodwill if the Biden administration would work to actually make this a priority in its dealings with the Caribbean. And for example, we've seen initiatives proposed along the lines of a debt for climate swap. So debt relief, which the Caribbean badly needs. It's one of the most highly indebted regions in the world, in exchange for sort of commitments or with those funds to be used to increase resilience, combat climate change. So I think there's an opportunity there for the US under the Biden administration to really focus on that issue. And more broadly, thinking about the debt issue, I'll just finish up by saying it's extremely difficult for the Caribbean to grow rapidly, bearing in mind the debt burden, which in many cases is caused by sort of the impact of hurricanes, which create a huge sort of financial burden for these countries. So I think multilaterally, I think we need to look at the Caribbean. I think this would generate goodwill for the Biden administration and the US towards the Caribbean, if we think that it's sort of strategically important to actually think about debt relief. Sort of, I mentioned that upper middle income countries aren't sort of eligible for debt relief under a lot of these multilateral initiatives. So that means the Caribbean gets hardly any debt relief, but it really should. So I think that is an issue above all else that I think needs to be sort of addressed in the Caribbean in this current context of sort of this sort of once in a generation pandemic that is creating a huge and difficult to manage burden on the Caribbean.
Thank you very much. Jessica, I'm going to give you the last word of the entire webinar.
Thank you. Well, Fiona, thank you very much for drawing attention to some of our most important priorities. I wanted to refer back to your comments on the US and China. I think that we are looking forward to a new era in relations with the United States. And I think there are some bright spots. For example, the common outlook on climate change issues. But I also think that the Caribbean is going to be walking a difficult tightrope between the United States and China. And it's not in the interests of most countries in the Caribbean to put all their eggs in one basket. We thrive from having multiple development partners and pursuing positive projects with them all. And it is that aspect of our international relations is going to entail a difficult balance in the near future, I would think.
Jessica, let me ask just a very, very quick question. We're over, but there's a lot of had been hand wringing among some in Canada that its traditionally strong relationship with the Caribbean they had let it lapse and weaken, and it's not what it used to be. Quickly, do you see a resurgence or an attempt to rebuild from the Canadian government the traditionally strong relationship with the Caribbean?
Yes, I think that we have seen that in the past year with the initiatives that were started first by Prime Minister Holness in Jamaica and Prime Minister Trudeau to start speaking about multilateral development funding, renewal of multilateral development financing for development. That grew into a much larger initiative and was focused on very much at the UN during the past few months. I think that has been important and very positive for both sides. And I think the Caribbean has a very outstanding diaspora in Canada. Canada tends to get the cream of the crop as far as Caribbean migrants. And that those citizens, most of whom are still very concerned with developments in their ancestral countries, creates another strong link between Canada and the Caribbean. And I think Canada's importance in the Caribbean. Canada has a very strong credit in the Caribbean in terms of the society's view of the country. So all of those are positive features.
We ended on a positive note. That's
although Canadian banks are amongst the only foreign banks left in the region.
No, and I know it's a bit of an issue, but I would say relatively this has been finishing on a high note. So thank you, Jessica. We need to bring this to a close. Thank you to all our panelists, to our country analysts. Thank you for the audience for staying with us through these more than 2.5 hours for the 11th annual preview. As I mentioned at the top of the program, those many hours ago, that a video of the entire event should be on our website tomorrow, no later than the day after tomorrow, in its entirety at ccacanada.com. We invite you to view it and to distribute it to those in your networks. And as I also mentioned, we will have a strong slate of public events this year, as we did it last year. And we also have a strong slate of private roundtables for our premium membership. For those who want to inquire about the premium membership, please contact our Vice President, Martha Blackwell, at martha.blackwell@ccacanada.com. So until the next time, thank you all once again, and hope to meet you shortly again over these Zoom webinars. Have a good rest of your day.